Welcome to the Fully Mindful, where we explore what it means to live with intention, creativity, authenticity, and connection. I'm your host, Melissa Chareau, mindfulness and breathwork facilitator, neurodivergent lawyer and coach, and fellow human navigating this wild and beautiful ride we call life. On this podcast, we dive deep with interviews featuring inspiring guests, share solo mini episodes packed with guided mindfulness practices to help you center and thrive, and mix things up with tangents and sidebars, where my friend and fellow podcaster Debbie Harrell from the New World Normal joins me for some real, random, and meaningful conversations. So if you're ready to pause, reflect, and expand, you're in the right place. Let's get fully mindful.
Every time we have a drink, we actually create more cortisol, which is the damaging hormone that's associated with stress that actually leads to, if it's chronically elevated over time, leads to burnout. So the drinking, while it feels like it's helping us in the moment, because of that initial depressant effect, when we're looking at it in the bigger picture, is actually just making all of it that much worse.
So a little while ago, a friend of mine, Suzanne Aronowitz, who's an amazing coach herself, connected me with a woman named Wendy McCallum. And I was absolutely floored when I met with her because despite living on the other side of, she's on the other side of Canada, so I can't even say the other side of the country. We have so much in common. She's a former lawyer. She's a coach. She has suffered from her own burnout and overcoming the effects of alcohol on her life. And we just hit it off. And so I knew I had to have her on the podcast. And she talks about exactly that. She talks about how burnout sucks. She talks about how the pandemic made it a lot harder for everyone, but especially women who were already doing it all. And we are all trying to be the best mother, the best at our career, the best spouse, the best community member. And I'm sure a lot of men were trying to do the very same thing in terms of being the best parents and the best men in their life. So she knows this story very, very well. And she's also very experienced. She's certified as a burnout and alcohol coach. She knows a heck of a lot about hormones. She knows about midlife. And she knows about how that can impact us even further. So you want to listen to this one. It's a lot of science about burnout, alcohol use, midlife hormones, and maybe more importantly, she offers gentle but directed wisdom around what we can do to prevent and treat burnout and live a happy, fulfilled life, something I know we all want to do. So hope you enjoy the conversation with Wendy McCallum. See you on the other side. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fully Mindful. This is Melissa Chareau, and I have with me here today Wendy McCallum. Excited to have her here today, and she is a burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert and the host of her own podcast, which is an excellent podcast called Bite-Sized Balance Podcast. Wendy teaches busy professionals who are nearing burnout and often using alcohol to cope how to reclaim time for themselves, reduce stress, build healthier habits, and increase their daily joy. Sounds good, doesn't it? She's no stranger to burnout herself. Wendy spent over 12 years working as a lawyer, then a partner in Calgary, Canada. As a busy litigator and mom of 2 young children, she struggled to find her work-life balance. In 2008, she left law to create a life she didn't need to escape from. She's been alcohol-free since January 2018 and is a senior certified naked mind alcohol coach. And we'll talk about how to find her after we get into some of the fun details of her story and the important work that she's doing. So welcome, Wendy. How are you?
Hello, Melissa. I'm great. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and I should tell the listeners too that Wendy and I met through a common acquaintance. She's a little bit more of an acquaintance more than an acquaintance for me. My friend Suzanne, I've known her, I've worked with her. We've done workshops together here in Portland, Oregon. But she and Wendy are connected, and she had the smart idea that we might actually like to talk with one another. And we did kind of like a blind date, as it were, on Zoom. And yeah, we, I think, fell in friendship or something, right?
Love match, love match. It was great.
That's awesome. So, yeah, Wendy and I both have been lawyers. I'm still a practicing lawyer. She is probably the smarter one and is no longer practicing law. And, we both are coaching people. We have a lot in common. But where she really has a lot of expertise and would love to hear more about is in burnout. But as I mentioned in her little introduction, she has her own burnout story. And I'd like to get into that a little bit if that's all right, Wendy.
Yes, absolutely. So I've actually had I actually have burnt out twice, which is not uncommon. I burnt the first time, my first major burnout really came while I was still practicing law. It's not the reason I left law. It just was not a great fit for me. It never really lit me up. But it was definitely all happening at the same time. So I took the sort of traditional route, I think, from law school. A lot of people take. I ended up in law school because it felt like the next thing I should do. So I always say I kind of shoulded myself into a career that wasn't the right career for me. And then ended up doing well in law school. And then I felt like I should take the job at the big corporate commercial law firm. And so I did. And for the first 6 or 7 years that I was working there, I wasn't very happy, but I was making it work. I didn't have any kids yet. Once I had my children, everything shifted. I have kind of a unique story in terms of how I had my kids. My son is adopted, and he was adopted in November of 2003 as a brand new baby. And I was actually about 9 weeks pregnant at the time, but I'd had many pregnancy losses and did not have a lot of faith that pregnancy was going to succeed, but it turned out that it did. And a couple of months after my son was born, I was on maternity leave with him from the firm, and I got called in by the partners for the partnership talk. So they wanted to make me a partner. At the time, the only real route to partnership was full equity partnership. There was no entry into the partnership as a non-equity partner. And so, I'm in this is very awkward. I'm in this meeting with them. I'm pregnant. By this time, I'm probably I would have been past 3 months pregnant at this point. So very certain, much more certain that the pregnancy was going to, continue to term. And so I had to tell them that not only am I on mat leave right now for another however many months, 5 months, but I'm also going to have another baby in 6 months. And then I'm going to need another mat leave after that. And anyway, long story short, I managed to negotiate a non-equity track as an entry point to the partnership, which I'm still not really sure how I did that, which was probably my savior. It's probably what allowed me to stay. I stayed for another 5 years after that, but I did end up having my daughter 7 months after my son. So I had these two very young kids, and they were very generous, and I had a really very good mat leave, but all of the pressures of the practice of law. And then on top of that, the pressures of partnership were just pretty onerous. And I ended up back at the firm after the end of the second mat leave, and stayed for another 3 years. But that's when I really, really started to struggle. It was just way too much. I was trying to do all of the things as we do. And it was very clear to me that I was not going to be able to do them all as well as I wanted to do them. But now, as someone who specializes in burnout and I've spent so much time in the world of burnout now with my clients, it's so clear to me that that's what was happening. So all of the common symptoms of burnout, I can now see them when I look back in hindsight on where I was. Things like the glass, going from half full to half empty, becoming more cynical about the work, starting to disconnect and depersonalize from other people I worked with and clients, and a slow increased reliance on unhealthy coping mechanisms, which is where the alcohol part comes in for me. That is when I started using alcohol as a way to relax and cope. And I hadn't up until that point used it at all. So I would use it not very much at that point, but occasionally pretty much always, I think on Friday nights, I would have a glass or two of wine, and it was not problematic for me at that time, but I can see that that's where it started. Anyway, happily, I made the decision to leave law and moved back to my home province on the other side of the country, and decided to stay home with my two 4-year-olds for a year, which was lovely. However, it was a huge transition for me as someone who had been so incredibly busy. So that actually ended up contributing further to the burnout. I think I was just so unhappy and kind of unstimulated, trying to make it really, really great, wanting it to be really, really, really great, but really struggling with loneliness because I had obviously left all of my friends, and also just really some boredom, even though I really loved my kids. So they went back to school, I went back to school, and that is where the coaching practice started. I went back and got my first certification, and from there continued and started to support women in the beginning around food and wellness. And then what I realized is most of the women I was working with were incredibly bright, very successful women, did not actually not know what they should be eating. They just could not figure out how the heck to make that work in their incredibly stressful lives. And that's where the burnout piece came in. Meanwhile, I'm still burnt out. So I'm not really recovering from my own burnout through this, and I'm drinking more. So over time, got kind of caught up in the mummy wine culture, which was really just taking off right at the time I had my kids. So that, sort of social, cultural messaging that we need wine to parent, and that it's totally okay to drink at all the kids' activities and basically all the time. And so that did not help. And the drinking just continued to escalate. So I don't know if I ever really came out of that first burnout is the point of this. I did change my career. I did have a whole lot less stress in my life, but burnout is not something that, for many people, it's not something that you recover from with just a month or two break. And if you just go right into something else that creates more stress and cortisol, then you can stay in it for a while. So I don't know in hindsight if I actually ever fully came out of that burnout. I'd like to say that it wasn't until I quit drinking 5 years ago that I fully recovered from burnout. But what happened is that there was sort of a secondary event that led to either a second burnout or just sort of a resurgence of the burnout symptoms, which was that my dad got sick. So I found myself in the sandwich generation. I was trying to take care of young kids and also support my mom and my father through his illness to his death. And that's when the drinking escalated even more as a coping mechanism. And that is actually when I finally quit. I quit a year before he died. So that's really my burnout story. It's sort of two parts, and it's just long and protracted. And yeah, I mean, I'm definitely on the other side of it now. And of course, in all of that, I'm getting older and I'm starting to go through a lot of the physiological and hormonal changes that women go through in perimenopause and menopause. So that's another piece of my own experience, and also now sort of my expertise as a coach for burnt out women in midlife that comes in play always in this conversation.
Let's take a quick break.
Hey everybody, this is Melissa with The Fully Mindful. It's the new year, and I bet you're feeling the need to unlock your full potential and embrace empowerment, or maybe something completely different. Well, I'm excited to offer a new program with one-on-one breathwork and coaching sessions. We'll embark on a truly transformative journey of self-discovery, combining conscious, connected breathwork and embodiment coaching, and more. So contact me, Melissa, at The Fully Mindful, for your transformative session today. Yeah, and I want to go back to this idea that you may not have been done with the burnout, and you maybe just went a little bit further down the elevator, right? Because I think that can happen. I think that's a really important piece to talk about. And I've certainly read, and I'm sure you've read tons and have experience with your clients on this idea of, well, if I just take some sort of sabbatical, I'll be okay. And in a way, that's kind of what you did with your kids. Okay, I'm going to take a year off. And it sounds like you didn't anticipate all the things that came with taking that year off. And, we're the messaging for women and mothering is like, oh, well, this is the quintessential, thing that women should do and be completely 100% satisfied with. And so when we're not, we feel like there's something, bad or wrong with us. Right. And I don't know if you had that sense during that time of your life, like I should be enjoying this more, like I should be better at this or that kind of thing.
I basically have had the sense since it feels like the beginning of time, that my life is perfect on paper, but that there's just something missing. I had that feeling since law school. And when I was practicing law, like I should be happy. What's the matter? I've got this great job. I've just been able to buy my first home, and then I'd met, my partner, and then I was able to have these two amazing kids. And so that feeling just continued on. And when I was home with my kids that year, it was the same thing. Wait a second, what? This isn't making me happy. I thought this was the missing piece. So yeah, it's a really good observation. And for many women, it is deeply satisfying and fulfilling to be at home with their kids. But for me, it wasn't enough. And I think that's totally okay. And I think we need to talk about that more.
Yeah. And then I think later you talked about, well, I guess I want to say like wherever we go, there we are, right? So we take ourselves with us. And so, if we don't do the work, which could involve an external change, but also involve some internal work, we're going to end up in the same place. It might be a change of scenery, but we end up in the same spot. And I know exactly what you're talking about. I have felt that way a lot of my life, of feeling like, there's just something like I should be happy. Anybody else in my circumstance would be so grateful that this is their life right now. So what is wrong with me? Sort of the question that I had posed for myself for a long time, which just adds more pressure, more shame, more, internal turmoil.
Absolutely. And it's actually one of the signs of burnout. I'm not saying that you were experiencing burnout, but it's interesting because I had that for a long time. And I think it was directly connected with the burnout. Is this idea of the way they describe it in the literature is a general dissatisfaction with life. But it always shows up for my clients the way it showed up for me. My burnt out clients always say something along those lines. I just don't get why I'm not happy. I have everything I thought I ever wanted. And so they also feel guilty, feeling like they need something else, which just, as you said, just sort of adds to the stress, adds to all of it. So sometimes that's a symptom of burnout. Sometimes it's just a sign that there's something missing in your life that you need to feel, resonant and fulfilled. But I do think it's worth noting that it is very often one of the signs of burnout.
Yeah. And it's interesting because later, when you get into this whole like mommy wine culture, which, I mean, we could spend a whole podcast talking about that. And, that's still really prevalent. You'll still find teachers t-shirts of that extol the virtues of day drinking for moms, and that we're entitled to it, and that's how we get through. And they make light of the fact that like this is how we get through parenting. And for anyone out there who's doubting themselves there, like that is not how we get through parenting. That's not how we get through anything. We don't need to drink in order to cope. There are other healthy mechanisms.
It's just terrible messaging for moms. Obviously, it suggests that somehow we can't handle this. We can absolutely handle it. And also motherhood's hard, and it's okay that it's hard. And it's okay to talk about the fact that it's hard, and it's okay to ask for help. What we really need is a rest. We're trying to do everything. And then the other really damaging piece of that, and again, we could talk about this forever. We won't, but I just want to mention this, is the message it sends to our kids. So this idea that somehow we need alcohol because it's so hard to parent them. I mean, there are onesies out there. I remember actually thinking about buying this, so I'm not judging anyone who talks this way. I did all of this stuff before I realized how it was affecting me and how the alcohol wasn't serving me. But I remember looking at a onesie and laughing and actually considering purchasing it that said, I drink because mommy drinks because I whine, or because I cry. Mommy drinks because I cry. But that's just for a little baby. But the messaging around like it takes a village to parent and a vineyard to homeschool. That was going around during the pandemic, which, the kids who are being homeschooled are old enough to read the meme. And I think it's terrible for so many different reasons. But the best thing we can do is, once we recognize that's happening, we become aware of it, is just stop liking, stop sharing, stop talking that way. Because it's really just women making it harder for other women. Honestly, that's, we are perpetuating something that doesn't serve us.
Yeah. And I mean, it does kind of reminds me of the whole hysterical woman thing, right? Like women can't handle this. They're just, it's just too much. They're fragile. They can't handle all of this, which is just simply not true. But it also takes the attention away from, any systemic causes. Like you said, here's the thing. The messaging is do all the things, woman. You have to be the most incredible mother. You have to have an incredible career. You have to be the incredible wife or partner. You have to have all your shit together at all times. And, instead of looking at what might be wrong with that, it's, oh, mommy just needs to drink some wine and she'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, most of us are, I'm a Gen Xer, and most of us in Gen X grew up being told that we could do it all. We could do anything that a boy could do. I was told that over and over again when I was growing up, which was technically true. But the problem is that by the time I got to the place where I was doing the things that the boys were doing, the boys were not doing the things that the girls were doing. So the girls were doing all the things the girls had to do and all the things the boys were doing. So nobody told me that in order to have it all, I was also going to have to do it all. And that's the conundrum. And I do think things are slowly shifting from a cultural perspective, but there was this catch up that needed to happen there. And we're not there yet. And so women are taking on, the bulk of the emotional labor and also the caretaking labor, and then also trying to work. So yeah, it's a recipe for burnout.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I'm not to say that you can't experience burnout without having to do all of the things, but it certainly exacerbates the situation, right? If you are trying to do all of the things and you're wondering, and I've done this. Well, why? Somebody said to me the other day, I think I was at a meeting, and they were asking me about what I was doing. And so I was like, well, I've got this job, and then I do coaching on the side, and then I have this podcast, and then I also do this, and I have a child and this. And they were like, wait, what? And I kind of had that moment of clarity of like, right, I'm on the speed train to burnout if I continue in this way, because I've been here before. And, I'm sure a lot of the listeners out there, women or men, have felt that way too, right? It's like society expects us to be able to pull it all off, to have our, hashtag best life, right? And then we wonder why we can't do it all, because when we look at social media, it looks like everybody is able to do it all. Right?
Oh gosh, don't even get me started. Just so the listeners are clear on this, nobody is nailing it. Like, the social media is so unhelpful for women overall. I wish it would just go away, but it's not going to go away. But I do think it's really important. And we were actually talking about this when I had you on as a guest on my podcast about how unhelpful it is, and how we need to really start to purposefully and consciously choose to show up vulnerable as we are, truthfully and honestly. And I'm like, I was saying, I never use filters. I just refuse to use filters, even though they would make me look so much younger and better. I can't do it. And I think it's really important for us to show up as we are and admit that life is not remotely perfect, and none of us are nailing it. So yes, I
love that. My husband had this idea at one point a few years ago. He's like, why don't we just have like an Instagram account that just shows like what we do in like actual life, like show a picture of like the toilet, like, oh, I just went to the toilet, or, like I just went to the mailbox or whatever. He's like, nobody would look at it, but like, that's reality.
There is actually an app, and now I'm drawing a blank. I know my daughter's on it. My daughter's 18, and I forget what it's called, but basically you get told to take a picture at a certain point, and you have to take a picture, and it's just real life. And so they're posting, here I am on the bus, here I am on, I don't know exactly what you're talking about, really boring pictures. But yeah, that's, that is not the world of Instagram, which is where most women of our age are hanging out. And that's unfortunate.
Well, and it's, it's highly, the influence is strong. I pride myself on being a pretty smart woman, and yet I have purchased, I can't even tell you how many things from Instagram. So it's clearly working. Things I don't need, whether they're courses or actual items. And so, yes, we could talk about the misery of social media, the evil of social media. It can do some good too. So I do recognize that, but
yeah,
it does not help for burnout. That is for sure, because it certainly seems like everybody's able to do all the things with a beautiful smile on their face while looking very young and beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's definitely not helpful at all.
So Let's talk a little bit also about alcohol, because I think some of the people that you work with, like your experience was as well, lean on alcohol as a coping mechanism. Like it actually works until it doesn't, right? And so talk a little bit about the effects of alcohol in terms of burnout and stress.
Yeah, I wish I'd known and understood this a lot earlier than I did. My drinking, the career profession of law is just, it's not an easy profession to not drink in. It became part of my business world when I was 26 and started working, and just kind of ramped up from there, as I said. But the thing I didn't really understand is the connection between alcohol and exacerbating burnout and stress symptoms. So every time we have a drink, alcohol is a depressant, but what people don't understand is that most people don't know is that it's also a stimulant. So there's a depressant effect that happens in our brain, and then our brain, because it's such a brilliant organ, is going to notice that right away, and then it's going to go into an active rebalancing mode. It's going to try to maintain something called homeostasis, and in order to do that, it's going to have to pump out something to balance out the depressant. And what it pumps out is the excitatory hormones that are part of the stress response. So it pumps out adrenaline, it pumps out cortisol. So every time we have a drink, we actually create more cortisol, which is the damaging hormone that's associated with stress that actually leads to, if it's chronically elevated over time, leads to burnout. So the drinking, while it feels like it's helping us in the moment, because of that initial depressant effect, when we're looking at it in the bigger picture, is actually just making all of it that much worse. The other thing that's happening when we're drinking is that it is contributing to increased anxiety, which for many women is part of burnout and part of midlife. Statistically, you have an increased likelihood of developing anxiety and depression, frankly, in your 40s as you head into perimenopause. And obviously alcohol is a depressant, so it doesn't help with depression. And it's also, as I said, because of those stimulant hormones, those are the same hormones that are happening in an anxious response. So it's making all of that stuff worse. And the other thing that's happening that I think is just fascinating, and this is more tied to the hormones in midlife and perimenopause. When, of course, perimenopause is described as the sort of the 7 to 10 years before you go through full menopause. And full menopause is an entire year since your last menses, your last period. So 7 to 10 years for most women before that date of full menopause, which is, I think the average is like 51, 52, that means that you're starting in like your mid 40s kind of thing. Sometimes earlier than that, but usually by the time you're in your mid 40s, this is happening. And what's happening in perimenopause is actually really fascinating. I used to assume that what was happening in perimenopause is that my estrogen was just like slowly declining, right? But that's actually not what's happening at all. There's a cycling and a real fluctuation of hormones. It's very messy. Your hormones are all over the place during that period. Sometimes they're high, sometimes they're low. It's not predictable, and it is definitely not that kind of steady decline. And the reason this matters is because what really contributes to those symptoms that we typically associate with perimenopause is the balance between the hormones. So it's not so much the amount of each hormone as it is how they're balanced, so the ratio between them. So progesterone and estrogen, for example, there's sort of, there's a ratio that needs to be there between those two things. What's really interesting in terms of the connection between stress and that ratio is that cortisol as the stress hormone and progesterone as the reproductive hormone, both of those hormones use the same precursor ingredient. So they both need the same thing to be manufactured in our bodies. And that's something called pregnenolone. And then, so what happens is when we're stressed out and we're in midlife, especially if we're burnt out, we're in chronic stress, our body is always going to prioritize short-term survival over long-term survival. That's how we're wired. So managing stress, creating cortisol to manage stress, the stress hormone, is always going to get prioritized over creating progesterone, the reproductive hormone, because of course, reproduction is all about our long-term survival. We don't need to reproduce today in order to stay alive tomorrow, right? So what happens is we end up producing the cortisol at the expense of the progesterone. So the balance gets thrown off. So it can just exacerbate all of those symptoms, if that makes sense. And so when I'm working with women, they're almost always in midlife, they're almost always in perimenopause or have just transitioned through menopause and they're burnt out. All of these, it's like a hormone soup that's happening and everything's just kind of a mess. And it can really make you feel a whole lot worse, if that makes sense. I went off on a little tangent there, but hopefully that's
No, I think that's important and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the impact of alcohol use, especially for perimenopausal or menopausal women, can really be, the whole impact is exacerbated by the use of alcohol.
Yeah. Well, in alcohol, so drinking itself, other than what I was talking about in terms of that creation of that cortisol that happens, which just exacerbates what I was just talking about, but alcohol itself for in other ways will exacerbate the symptoms of perimenopause. So for example, we know that alcohol as a substance will cause women's bodies to create more estrogen, so it can mess up the balance. And also alcohol is a vasodilator, which means that it contributes to hot flashes and night sweats, which is one of the primary, areas of complaints for women in perimenopause and menopause. And red wine, for example, is full of histamines, which will also increase that the likelihood of that type of a response in our body. So an inflammatory response. So, those are just three ways where it directly impacts our hormones. But then we also have the sleep disruptions that come with drinking. So, there's this is one of the things I always like to share on a podcast, because a lot of women believe what I believed. Like I really believed alcohol was helping me sleep.
When I used it, that was I've always had difficulty sleeping. I have ADHD. And so, I have a very awake brain, especially at certain times of the day. And I was convinced that alcohol was helping me sleep.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's so common. And I definitely believe that too. And of course, it does help you go to sleep initially because it's a depressant. But what is happening, I was talking earlier about the body's attempt to maintain homeostasis and how the brain's going to pump out those excitatory hormones. There's a delay between the depressant effect and the excitatory hormones. And so if you have a glass of wine, usually you're pouring your second glass of wine and drinking that before the impact of those excitatory hormones kicks in. And the depressant effect of the second glass of wine just kind of like masks that, if that makes sense. And that continues for as many drinks as you have. But when you do go to bed and you have the last hit of the depressant, there will be a noticeable spurt of those excitatory hormones. And there's usually a lag in that. And this is the main reason why women who drink end up waking up at 3:30 or whatever. Everyone's got their time. For me, it was always around 3:30 a.m., totally wired, right? And it's because I'm basically in fight or flight in the middle of the night as a result of those hormones. And then that can lead to all kinds of things for most women. That's when the anxiety starts to rear its head, oftentimes around the drinking. So, oh my gosh, why did I have a drink again last night? I said I wasn't going to drink last night. What's the matter with me? I used to go downstairs and Google, am I an alcoholic, and try to figure out ways to moderate. That's what I did in the middle of the night a lot. So it's definitely disruptive of sleep. It makes it more difficult for us to get good REM sleep. It's not helpful for sleep. So that is a real myth that bears dispelling.
And it's also true for men. And I, for possibly different reasons, but I don't know if you listen to the Andrew Huberman podcast or follow Peter Attia, but both of them have said on separate podcasts, they're both doctors, one's a PhD, one's an MD, and they've done deep dives into alcohol. And, they're not on a mission to try to get everyone to stop drinking, but they've said, look, we've looked at all of the research. There is no amount of alcohol that is good for you. Doesn't mean, people can't use it responsibly, that et cetera, but know the risks.
Yeah, I'm not out on some anti-alcohol campaign, but when women in midlife are struggling with burnout and they're exhausted and they're barely keeping it together and they're drinking a couple of glasses of wine every night as a way to sort of decompress and get to sleep, I think I want them to be doing that with some informed, to have an informed consent around that. I think we just have such, we have such misinformation around this. And obviously one of the other main symptoms of perimenopause and menopause, aren't they fun, is just generally sleep disruptions. Like women do not sleep as well. And so given all of that, I think we need to at least understand the consequences of making the decision to have to have the drinks in the evening, especially. The other thing that happens is our window of tolerance starts to shrink as we get older. So any substance that is going to be irritating, like sugar can be, irritating, caffeine can be irritating, and alcohol, we just have a smaller window for that stuff. We can't tolerate it and deal with it in the same way. It affects us in a bigger way, which is why a lot of women in perimenopause and menopause end up cutting back on caffeine, for example, and also decreasing the amount of sugar they eat because they're noticing they're having some swings with it. So the same thing happens with alcohol. We just can't handle it the same way we could when we were 20. It affects us in a different way. And it's worth understanding that and then making decisions accordingly.
Yeah. And I think, at least the research I've done is the pandemic didn't help the situation. Everybody, no matter what gender, began to drink more and be impacted by what that was doing to their body and their brains and their emotions and their psyche.
Yeah, unfortunately, more for women. So there was definitely a difference. Binge drinking with women went up drastically. Binge drinking, depending on where you are, is defined differently. So now in Canada, anything more than 2 drinks is considered at a time is not recommended. Just because we have these new guidelines in the States, it's probably more like 3 or 4 drinks at a time would be considered binge drinking. But that went up drastically in the pandemic. And of course, so did burnout, because women were now, especially for women, burnout across the board, but definitely for women, because women were now doing like a whole other shift, which for many of us involved managing school stuff. So we had kids home, my kids were in high school, and it actually was quite a lot of work to, depending on the type of learner that you have as a kid, it can be a lot of work to manage online schooling if your kid's not self-motivated.
Well, and especially, these kids are experiencing all the things that we're experiencing: fear, loneliness, anxiety, all of that. And so here they are trying to pretend things are normal by doing online school at home without any of the supports, even though the parents are doing the best that they can. It is not easy for them, and it's not easy for the parents. And I still find that, we're not completely back to normal. For instance, at my job, we're not back in the office. A lot of places are sticking to some sort of hybrid way of doing things. So going back to the office, maybe part-time, staying at home, the other part-time. And what I've noticed, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, is that there seems to be this expectation that if you're home, 1, you're never sick, you can't call in sick. And 2, you're still doing all of the things. And that is exacerbating the burnout that I'm seeing with people, is this idea of like, wait a minute, I'm still supposed to be doing all of the things. I'm never out sick because, I could just show up on a Zoom call, right? Is sort of the thought. So have you seen the impact?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways. I think it's really a personal thing. For some people, it's just so much easier to maintain some kind of a routine around self-care if they're not having to commute for a couple of hours a day. So it definitely, the commute piece plays in for some people. But then at the same time, for many people, especially the women that I work with, the commute is a bit of a break. It's an opportunity to get some downtime and to be alone and have some space, and sometimes work feels like that too. So yes, I hear everything you're saying, and I think that's absolutely true. And for a lot of people working at home, the isolation and the expectations around being able to do everything and always being available makes it really hard. But it kind of goes both ways. I'm hoping we get to a place where we have a hybrid model that works for some industries. Also, staying at home works a whole lot better than other industries. And so I'm hoping that there's some good learning out of the pandemic that we can actually use to create systems for employment that are more supportive of work-life balance for people, and that help to prevent the burnout. But I mean, we've had a mass exodus from the workplace. Like, it's actually called the Great Resignation, and it's a movement. So many people left work as a result of the pandemic, and that's for all kinds of different reasons. And for some people, it's because they realized, I don't want to go to an office 9 to 5 every day anymore. That's not what I want. So Yeah. I don't know if it'll be interesting to see the research on all of this, how this all plays out in a couple more years as we start to understand the social, psychological, cultural consequences of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting too. Right now, it sort of feels like a no-win situation because, like you said, there are a lot of benefits for many for staying at home. Like you said, being able to engage in some self-care, having more time. But then again, you don't have the break. You don't have the interaction that you do when we as humans need that social interaction. And that doesn't just come from Zoom. Like there's something about physical proximity to other humans that we all found out during the pandemic is really important. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if there's a model that arises that can actually work for more people. And it is interesting. I mean, there's the Great Resignation is not over. I know it's not talked about quite as much, but in every industry, people have not returned to work. I don't know what they're doing, but they have not returned to work.
Yeah. It is very interesting. Well, a lot of them have started their own businesses. So that's very, I see that a lot, especially it's a very common thing for women who have finally gotten free from alcohol, especially if that coincides with the end of perimenopause and moving through menopause, for them to just get to a place where they take back some agency in their life and create something that feels better for them. So I've been seeing that all along, but it's definitely happening more as a result of the pandemic experience, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is. So getting to maybe the hope side of this equation, we've covered what doesn't work for burnout, what exacerbates burnout. What have you found and what tools do you use to help women who have experienced or, maybe on the cusp of experiencing or are in the depths of experiencing burnout and need to get out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look realistically at your life and recognize, I always say this whenever I'm talking about stress, some of the stress is here to stay, and that's totally okay. We're built for stress. So stress is okay. What we're not built for is chronic unmitigated stress. And that's what leads to burnout. So the place to start, if you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed, like so many others right now, is to take a look at what you're doing every day, what's filling up your day, get really super aware of that, which of course requires the mindfulness that you're such an advocate of. Start paying attention to that and noticing how you're spending your time and how many of the things that you're doing are bringing you energy versus draining you of energy. That's a really great place to start. And then once you have that list, it's probably going to be a little shocking how much longer the list of energy drains is than gains. But now that you have that information, you can actually start making some changes. And so you have to stand in personal responsibility. It's not your fault. You got where you are. But now that you know, it is your responsibility to change it because no one's coming. No one's going to do that for you. So this is actually a hopeful message, I think. Look at that list of drains and ask yourself, okay, how do I start taking some of these things off the list? What can I start saying no to or delegate or, just completely delete from my life? And that is obviously doesn't happen overnight. So the first thing I'm always teaching women, we're always working on, I call it delaying the yes. So stop saying yes to everything right away. And that is a practiced art. And normally there's a fear that if I say no to something, there's going to be some major consequence. It might be that that person doesn't like me anymore. That could be the consequence. Or it might be that, literally the sky will fall and the thing won't get done right. But I would say challenge your assumptions on that because most of them are wrong. And the only way to know that is to go out there and experiment with just saying no more often, delaying the yes, as I say, or, consciously choosing to care less about something and just seeing what happens when you do. The example I always use it's a personal example from home, but I cooked my kids' whole lives. I cooked almost all of the meals from scratch. I have this past life where I was like a food person. I published 2 cookbooks. I had a food blog, so food was my life and I was cooking all the time and it was always very good, healthy food. And I just lost my mojo in perimenopause, basically didn't want to do it anymore, but felt like I had to, and really was making a lot of assumptions around what would happen if I stepped back a little from those duties. But when my kids were in grade 11 and 12, I started experimenting with it. And one of the things I did was I started buying a couple of frozen meals a week every time I went grocery shopping and putting them in the freezer. And we started having frozen pizza or frozen falafels or something, once a week. And Nothing happened, Melissa. Nobody cared. Like nothing happened, except that it freed up 2 whole nights a week where I didn't even have to think about food. So that's just a little micro example of that. But if you can continue experimenting with those things, you can slowly take a number of things off your list, because the only way to recover from burnout or to prevent it from happening, if you're not there yet, is to do less. You have to do less. We have to give ourselves an opportunity to both rest. So to close the stress cycle and come back into the relaxation response, which is where our cortisol and adrenaline come back down again. And that really involves any activity that is relaxing to you, any activity that is restful, anything, I would say, anything that would be impossible for you to do if you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger probably falls into that category. Reading a book, sitting down with a friend to have a chat, going for a walk outside. Those are the types of things that will help you close that stress cycle. But in order to get more of those in your life, you have to do less of the other things, right? So that's really the really simple answer to how we come back from burnout or prevent it from fully setting in. It's really consciously working on doing less. And then with the time we create by doing less, working hard to incorporate more of the activities that bring us joy and actually are restful, and close that stress cycle for us.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like you're talking directly to me. So, right now, I'm just like, yep, okay, yes, note to self. It's interesting. I think in this culture, and especially for women, and probably for men too, we have this idea that we have to be doing in order to be of value, right? I'll speak for myself. I will often, and this is just inaccurate thinking, will have a story that resting is somehow not doing. It is actually doing something. You are doing something by resting. And what you're doing is really valuable to yourself and to the people around you. And you end up having more energy for the things that you really do love. And you end up having a better ability to think more deeply, to feel more deeply, to be more present in our lives. But we get used to being on this path of like, go, 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 go. I got to go from one thing to the next. I mean, and the pandemic, at least for me, made things kind of worse, which, I started looking at, let's say, my Outlook calendar or my calendar on my phone and would book things literally back to back. Wait a minute. You can't be, there was no commute time allowance or, just a moment to reflect allowance. And I think we're all getting better about that, especially when we work with people like you, and we're starting to be a little bit more mindful about how our days look and starting to have this realization that we don't have to do, at least in that traditional way, all of the time, that we're still, in fact, better people and better for ourselves and better for those around us if we take a little time to ourselves, right?
100%. I mean, we have two states as humans. We are either doing or we're being. And if we're doing all the time, we spend no time being. And if we're being all the time, we get nothing done. So it's about finding that balance between those two things. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, I interviewed a woman on the podcast, my podcast a while ago about a book she wrote about alcohol and drinking. But one of the things she said that really resonated with me was, she was sort of addressing some of these myths, these reasons why we think we need alcohol in our lives. And one of the very big ones is, I deserve this. This is a reward. I've earned this. This is a treat. And it kind of ties into what you're saying, the whole doing thing, and just asking yourself, what is it that I actually deserve right now? What is it that I actually need? And the answer is almost universally always a rest. That's what I need. I need a break. I need a rest. And, this idea that resting is somehow not productive is crazy. I mean, it's the only way to prevent burnout is to rest, to do things that actually, like I said before, close that stress cycle, calm you down, help you regulate your nervous system. And there's a really great little quote that I like. I like to attribute it to Bertrand Russell. Some people attribute it to someone else. I think it's Bertrand Russell. But anyway, the quote is, time you enjoy wasting is not wasted time. And I say that probably 3 times a week to my clients. Find the thing that you enjoy doing that allows you to lose time, the thing that you start doing it and before you know it, an hour's passed. that's valuable wasted time. That's the time that is pulling you out of fight or flight and calming you down. That's the time that's probably bringing you great joy. And it's also the time that is probably giving your body an opportunity to literally come down from this cortisol high and rest, right? So yes, we need to rest.
And, I teach mindfulness and I'm a big proponent of mindfulness. So I'm not trying to suggest that we should not do mindfulness. But if anyone is like me, we can sometimes turn mindfulness into a doing rather than
absolutely. Yeah.
And, it starts to become like another thing to check off the list.
100%. Yep.
And so I am also a big proponent to find the thing that literally, maybe has no value at all. The less value, the better, right?
The less producing. So the thing we do as women is that we associate the production of something, the productivity with the value. And so finding something that doesn't have an end output is often, that is a really challenging thing for women to commit.
It is.
So what you're looking for is something that doesn't necessarily have an output at the end. So maybe you're doing some kind of a creative artsy type thing. And at the end of it all, you just chuck it in the garbage. That's a valuable time spent. Maybe you produce something great. Maybe you don't. One of the things I often give as kind of an accountability or homework assignment to my burnout clients is to take a day and plan nothing. And it is the hardest thing for women to do, but to take a Saturday, take everything off the calendar and then just roll with it. And, get into that experiment mindset, stay curious, see what happens. How does it feel?
Yeah. And I noticed like when you just asked that question and I thought, oh my gosh, that is really hard. Where I've gotten it, where it becomes easier and we can practice, like for instance, is if you're lucky enough to be able to travel to a place that you've never been, even if it's an hour away, doesn't matter, and you can just spend the day just strolling around, looking around, nothing to see, nothing to do, just letting the day take you can be a really like a lot more of an accessible way to access that idea of just
do that in your hometown too. That's what I do on the weekends. One day a weekend, my husband and I have no agenda. We get up and I say, what do you feel like doing?
Yeah.
And we go for a walk and we find a place and we have coffee or breakfast. And then we, stroll around, we come back, someone has a nap. It's the best.
It's a beautiful thing. It is.
And that is what the weekends are for, right? So we're working a 5-day work week, which is already a long week. I'm a huge fan of a 4-day work week. We're working, most of us, a 5-day work week, and the weekend is meant to be that time to just give your body an opportunity to recharge and restore. And instead, we're just jamming it full of chores. And I get that there are some things that need to be done on the weekend, but ask yourself how many of those things actually need to happen and what might happen if you said no to some of those things this weekend. What might be available for you if you just had a block of time? What would you like to spend that time doing? And by doing, I don't mean producing, but just how would you waste that time if you had it?
I think we could all learn a little thing from my 14, almost 15-year-old daughter. She's brilliant at this, and I mean that. I'm inspired by her. So she loves to draw, and she's quite good at it. But she doesn't do it to necessarily share it with anyone or do anything with it. And then she might walk down to the bookstore and just pick out a book and sit, in the chair and just read. And then she'll wander around. It's beautiful. And I'm so glad that she gets that. And I think it must be innate because both my husband and I are massive doers and we're still working on that piece. But I mean, that's the thing, right? Like we need that time and it's not wasted time. It's time that we need. Yeah.
It's not. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I do not know what that thing is that I would do, like I'm really struggling with that. That's so common. It's totally okay. Think back to a time when you felt great, sometimes women need to go right back to their childhood, but what did you used to do that brought you joy? What are some of those things you did? It might be before you had kids, before you started the job, but what used to bring you joy? So 2 things I've discovered in the last 5 years. 1, riding a bicycle, very simple, something I stopped doing that I am doing again. And 2, writing. So 2 things I used to do when I was a kid, stopped doing when I became a teenager and haven't done for decades. but they brought me joy then. And if it brought you joy then, there's a pretty good chance it's going to bring you joy now. So go and try those things. That's a great place to start.
Love that. Well, as we round things out, I know people are going to want to find out more about you and what you do, and not only see your podcast, listen to your podcast, but just get more of Wendy. I know I want to. So tell us how we can do that.
Oh, you're sweet. Well, you can find me on my website, which is just wendymccallum.com. And the information on the podcast, The Bite-Sized Balance, is there as well. And that you can listen to anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to put, of course, that in the show notes. And any last parting wisdom that you want to give us before we hit stop?
Oh my gosh, that's a high stress question, Melissa, to end our relaxing burnout prevention podcast on. No, you know what? I think just give yourself a break. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word. Self-compassion is so, so important. And we're just notoriously terrible at it. But, if you're feeling a certain way, chances are you're feeling the way most women feel. It's so common to get to this place in midlife where you feel very overwhelmed, very exhausted, depleted, and also maybe just a little bit resentful of the fact that you're there. And that's totally okay. It can absolutely get better. It will get better, but it's going to require some active, participation by you. And again, the podcast is a great place to start. Bite-Sized Balance. We talk about different topics around this all of the time. So there are lots of ideas there on how to kick that, as I like to say, step into personal agency and decide what you want to do with the rest of your life.
Yeah. And take some rest time.
Absolutely. That might be what you want to do. Rest.
Well, thank you so much, Wendy. It's been amazing to have you on the podcast. And I know I'll be talking to you soon, but I'm excited to have you here. And I know people are going to get a lot of value from what you shared with us today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa. It's been great.
Hey, everybody. If you like this conversation, make sure to rate the show in Apple or Spotify or wherever you are listening so that others can find it and enjoy it too. And if you like the show and want to keep hearing great conversations with really interesting people about how they found their purpose, please donate to the show. Go to thefullymindful.com to donate today. Hey, everybody, it's Melissa, and I'm wondering if you all can relate. Have you ever caught yourself procrastinating or maybe doubting your abilities, or maybe you have a black belt inner critic like I do or have had that wants to sabotage your every move with judgment and perfectionism expectations? It might keep you stuck, it might keep you anxious and away from your full potential. The Positive Intelligence Program, PQ, is a powerful 6-week journey designed to help you quiet those saboteurs, embrace positivity, and find flow in your life. Through daily practices and weekly focuses, we'll work together to build your mental fitness. The PQ app will guide you every step of the way and support you, and you'll be supported either by myself in a one-on-one or in a small group of like-minded individuals where you can share insights and progress. So reach out, contact me at info@thefullymindful.com to find out how we can work together one-on-one or in a small group today.